Hello and welcome to Bookspot. I'm Earl Wajenberg. This time we're going to continue our reading of The Carasoyn, a fairy tale by George MacDonald. Our hero Colin has lost a little girl who was taken by the fairies. He had a chance to get her back and blew it. Chapter 3. The Old Woman and Her Hen. In the morning, however, his courage had returned, for the word Carasoyn was always saying itself in his brain. People in fairy stories, he said, always find what they want. Why should I not find this Carasoyn? It does not seem likely, but the world doesn't go round by likely, so I will try. But how was he to begin? When Colin did not know what to do, he always did something. So as soon as his father was gone to the hill, he wandered up the stream down which the fairies had come. But I needn't go on so, he said, for if the Carasoyn grew at the fairies' country, the queen would know how to get it. All at once he remembered how he had lost himself on the moor when he was a little boy, and had gone into a hut and found there an old woman spinning. And she had told him such stories and shown him the way home. So he thought she might be able to help him now, for he remembered that she was very old then and must be older and still wiser now. And he resolved to go and look for the hut and ask the old woman what he was to do. So he left the stream and climbed the hill and soon came upon a desolate moor. The sun was clouded and the wind was cold and everywhere looked dreary, and there was no sign of a hut anywhere. He wandered on looking for it, and all at once found that he had forgotten the way back. At the same instant he saw the hut right before him, and then he remembered it was when he had lost himself that he had saw it the former time. It seems the way to find some things is to lose yourself, said he to himself. He went up to the cottage, which was like a large beehive built of turf, and knocked at the door. "Come in, Colin," said a voice, and he entered, stooping low. The old woman sat by a little fire, spinning after the old fashion with a distaff and spindle. She stopped the moment he went in. "Come and sit down by the fire," she said, "and tell me what you want." Then Colin saw that she had no eyes. "I'm very sorry you are blind," he said. "Never you mind that, my dear. I see more than you do for all my blindness. Tell me what you want, and I shall see at least what I can do for you." "How do you know I want anything?" asked Colin. "Now that's what I don't like," said the old woman. "Why do you waste words? Words should not be wasted any more than crumbs." "I beg your pardon," returned Colin. "I will tell you all about it." And so he told her the whole story. "Oh, those children," said the old woman. "They're always doing some mischief. They never know how to enjoy themselves without hurting somebody or other. I really must give that queen a bit of my mind. Well, my dear, I like you, and I will tell you what must be done. You shall carry the silly queen her bottle of Carasoyn, but she won't like it when she gets it, I can tell her. That's my business, however. First of all, Colin, you must dream 3 days without sleeping. Next, you must work 3 days without dreaming. And last, you must work and dream 3 days together." "How am I to do all that?" "I will help you all I can, but a great deal will depend on yourself. In the meantime, you must have something to eat." So saying, she rose, and going to a corner behind her bed, returned with a large golden-colored egg in her hand. This she laid on the hearth and covered over with hot ashes. She then chatted away to Colin about his father and the sheep and the cow and the housework, and showed that she knew all about him. At length she drew the ashes off the egg and put it on a plate. "It shines like silver now," said Colin. "That is a sign it is quite done," she said, and set it before him. Colin had never tasted anything half so nice, and he had never seen such a quantity of meat in an egg. Before he had finished it, he had made a hearty meal. But in the meantime, the old woman said, "Shall I tell you a story while you have your dinner?" "Oh, yes, please do," answered Colin. "You told me such stories before." "Jenny," said the old woman, "my wool is all gone. Get me some more." And from behind the bed out came a sober-colored but large and beautifully shaped hen. She walked sedately across the floor, putting down her feet daintily, like a prim matron as she was, and stopping by the door gave a cluck-cluck. "Oh, the door is shut, is it?" said the old woman. "Let me open it," said Colin. "Do, my dear." "What are all those white things?" he asked, for the cottage stood in the middle of a great bed of grass with white tops. "Those are my sheep," said the old woman. "You will see." Into the grass Jenny walked, and stretching up her neck, gathered the white woolly stuff in her beak. When she had as much as she could hold, she came back and dropped it on the floor, then picked the seeds out and swallowed them, and went back for more. The old woman took the wool, and fastening it on her distaff, began to spin, giving the spindle a twist, and then dropping it, and drawing out the thread from the distaff. But as soon as the spindle began to twirl, it began to sparkle all the colors of the rainbow, and it was a delight to see. And the hands of the woman, instead of being old and wrinkled, were young and long-fingered and fair, and they drew out the wool, and the spindle spun and flashed, and the hen kept going out and in, bringing wool and swallowing the seeds, and the old woman kept telling Colin one story after another, till he thought he could sit there all his life and listen. Sometimes it seemed the spindle that was flashing them, sometimes the long fingers that were spinning them, and sometimes the hen that was gathering them off the heads of the long dry grass and bringing them in her beak and laying them down on the floor. All at once the spindle grew slower and gradually ceased to turn. The fingers stopped drawing out the thread, the hen retreated behind the bed, and the voice of the blind woman was silent. "I suppose it is time for me to go," said Colin. "Yes, it is," answered his hostess. "Please tell me, then, how am I to dream 3 days without sleeping?" "That's over," said the old woman. "You've just finished that part. I told you I would help you all I could." "Have I been here 3 days, then?" asked Colin in astonishment. "And nights, too. And I and Jenny and the spindle are quite tired and want to sleep. Jenny has got 3 eggs to lay besides. Make haste, my boy." "Please, then, tell me what I am to do next." "Jenny will put you in the way. When you come where you are going, you will tell them that the old woman with the spindle desires them to lift Cumberbone Crag a yard higher and to send a flue under Stone Starve at Moss. Jenny, show Colin the way." Jenny came out with a surly cluck and led him a good way along a heath by a path only a hen could have found. But she turned suddenly and walked home again. 4. The Goblin Blacksmith. Colin could just perceive something suggestive of a track, which he followed till the sun went down. Then he saw a dim light before him, keeping his eye upon which he came at last to a smithy, where, looking in at the open door, he saw a huge hump-backed smith working a forehammer in each hand. He grinned out of the middle of his breast when he saw Colin, and said, come in, my youngsters will be glad of you." He was an awful-looking creature, with a great hare lip and a red ball for a nose. Whatever he did, speak or laugh or sneeze, he did not stop working one moment. As often as the sparks flew in his face, he snapped at them with his eyes, which were the color of a half-dead coal, now with this one, now with that, and the more sparks they got into them, the brighter his eyes grew. The moment Colin entered, he took a huge bar of iron from the furnace and began laying on it so with his 2 forehammers that he disappeared in a cloud of sparks, and Colin had to shut his eyes and be glad to escape with a few burns on his face and hands. When he had beaten the iron till it was nearly black, the smith put it in the fire again and called out 100 odd names. "Here, gob, shag, latchet, liquor, freestone, grey whacket, mousetrap, potato pot, blob, blotch, blunker." And ever as he called, one dwarf after another came tumbling out of the chimney, in the corner of which the fire was roaring. They crowded around Colin and began to make hideous faces and spit fire at him. But he kept a bold countenance. At length one pinched him, and he could not stand that, but struck him hard on the head. He thought he had knocked his own hand to pieces, it gave him such a jar, and the head rung like an iron pot. Come, young man," cried the smith, "you keep your hands off my children." "Tell them to keep their hands off me, then," said Colin. And calling to mind his message, just as they began to crowd about him again with yet more spiteful looks, he added, "Here, you imps, I won't stand it any longer. Get to your work directly. The old woman with the spindle says you're to lift Cumberbone Crag a yard higher and to send a flue under Stone Starve at Moss." In a moment they had vanished in the chimney. In a moment more the smithy rocked to its foundations. But the smith took no notice, only worked more furiously than ever. Then came a great crack and a shock that flew Colin to the floor. The smith reeled, but never lost hold of his hammers or missed a blow on the anvil. "Those boys will do themselves a mischief," he said. Then turning to Colin, "Here, you sir, take that hammer. This is no safe place for idle people. If you don't work, you'll be knocked to pieces in no time." The same moment there came a wind from the chimney that blew all the fire into the middle of the smithy. The smith dashed up upon the forge and rushed out of sight. Presently he returned with one of the goblins under his arm, kicking and screaming, laid his ugly head down on the anvil, where he held him by his neck, and hit him a great blow with his hammer above the ear. The hammer rebounded, the goblin gave a shriek, and the smith flung him into the chimney, saying, "That's the only way to serve him. You'll be more careful for one while, I guess, Slobberkin." And thereupon he took up his other hammer and began to work again, saying to Colin, "Now, young man, as long as you get a blow with your hammer in for every one of mine, you'll be quite safe. But if you stop or lose the beat, I won't be answerable to the old woman with a spindle for the consequences." Colin took up his hammer and did his best. But he soon found that he had never known what it was to work. The smith worked a hammer in each hand, and it was all Colin could do to work his little hammer with both his hands. So it was a terrible exertion to put in a blow for blow with the smith. Once, when he lost the time, the smith's forehammer came down on the head of his, beat it flat on the anvil, and flung the handle to the other end of the smithy, where it struck the wall with the report of a cannon. "I told you," said the smith. "There's another. Make haste, for the boys will be in want of you and me too before they get Cumberbone Crag half a foot higher." Presently in came the biggest-headed of the family out of the chimney. "6-foot wedges and a 3-foot crowbar," he said, "or Cumberbone will cumber our bones presently." The smith rushed behind the bellows, brought out a bar of iron 3 inches thick or so, cut off 3 yards, put the end in the fire, blew with might and main, and brought it out as white as paper. He and Colin then laid upon it till the end was flattened to an edge, which the smith turned up a little. He then handed the tool to the imp. "Here, Gob," he said, "run with it, and the wedges will be ready by the time you come back." Then to the wedges they set, and Colin worked like 3. He never knew how he could work before. Not a moment's pause, except when the smith was at the forge for another glowing mass. And yet, to Colin's amazement, the more he worked, the stronger he seemed to grow. Instead of being worn out, the moment he had got his breath, he wanted to be at it again, and he felt as if he had grown twice the size since he had took hammer in hand. And the goblins kept running in and out all the time, now for one thing, now for another. Colin thought if they made use of all the tools they fetched, they must be working very hard indeed. And the convulsions felt in the smithy bore witness to their exertions somewhere in the neighborhood. And the longer they worked together, the more friendly grew the smith. At length he said, his words always adding energy to his blows, "What does the old woman want to improve Stone-Starved Moss for?" "I didn't know she did want to improve it," returned Colin. "Why, anybody may see that. First, she wants Cumberbone Crag a yard higher, just enough to send the northeast blast over the moss without touching it. Then she wants a hot flue passed under it, plain as a forehammer. What did you ask her to do for you? She's always doing things for people and making my bones ache." "You don't seem to mind it much, though, sir," said Colin. "No more I do," answered the smith, with a blow that drove the anvil halfway into the earth, from which it took him some trouble to drag it out again. "But I want to know what she is after now." So Colin told him all he knew about it, which was merely his own story. I see," said the smith. "It's all moonshine, but we must do as she says, notwithstanding. And now it is my turn to give you a lift, for you have worked well. As soon as you leave the smithy, go straight to Stone-Starved Moss. Get on to the highest part of it, make a circle 3 yards across, and dig a trench round it. I will give you a spade. At the end of the first day, you will see a vine break the earth. By the end of the second, it will be creeping all over the circle. And by the end of the third day, the grapes will be ripe. Squeeze them one by one into a bottle. I will give you a bottle till it is full. Cork it up tight, and by the time the queen comes for it, it will be Carasoyn." "Oh, thank you," cried Colin. "When am I to go?" "As soon as the boys have lifted Cumberbone Crag and bored the flue under the moss. It is of no use till then." "Well, I'll go on with my work," said Colin, and struck away with the anvil. In a minute or two, in came the same goblin whose head his father had hammered, and said respectfully, "It's all right, sir. The boys are gathering their tools and will be home to supper directly." Are you sure you've lifted the crag a yard? Said the smith. Slumpkin says it's a half-inch over the yard. Grungle says it's 3/4, but that won't matter, will it? No, I dare say not, but it is much better to be accurate. Is the flue done? Yes, we managed that part in lifting the crag. Very well. How's your head? It rings a little. Let it ring you a lesson then, Slobberkin, in the future. Yes, sir. Now, master, you may go when you like, said the smith to Colin. We've nothing here you can eat, I'm sorry to say. Oh, I don't mind that. I'm not very hungry, but the old woman with the spindle said I was to work 3 days without dreaming. Well, you haven't been dreaming, have you? And the smith looked quite furious as he put the question, lifting his forehammer as if he would serve Colin like Slobberkin. No, that I haven't, answered Colin. You took good care of that, sir. The smith actually smiled. Then go along, he said. It's all right. But I've only worked 3 whole days and nights, interrupted the smith. Get along with you. The boys will bother you if you don't. Here's your spade and here's your bottle. 5. The Moss Vineyard. Colin did not need a hint more, but was out of the smithy in a moment. He turned, however, to ask the way. There was nothing in sight but a great heap of peats, which had been dug out of the moss and was standing there to dry. Could he be on Stone-Starved Moss already? The sun was just setting. He would look out for the highest point at once. So he kept climbing, and at last reached a spot whence he could see all round him for a long way. Surely that must be Cumberbone Crag looking down on him, and there at his feet lay one of Jenny's eggs, as bright as silver. And there was a little path, trodden and scratched by Jenny's feet, enclosing a circle just the size the smith had told him to make. He set to work at once, ate Jenny's egg, and then dug the trench. Those 3 days were the happiest he had ever known, for he understood everything he did himself and all that everything was doing around him. He saw what the rushes were, and why the blossom came out at the side, and why it was russet-colored, and why the pith was white and the skin green. And he said to himself, if I were a rush now, that's just how I should make a point of growing. And he knew how the heather felt with its cold roots and its head of purple bells, and the wise-looking cotton grass which the old woman called her sheep, and the white beard of which she spun into thread. And he knew what she spun it for, namely, to weave it into white cloth of which to make nightgowns for all the good people that were like to die. For one with one of those nightgowns upon him never died, but was laid in a beautiful white bed, and the door was closed upon him, and no noise came near him, and he lay there dreaming cool dreams till the world had turned round and was ready for him to get up again and do something. He felt the wind playing with every blade of grass in his charmed circle. He felt the rays of heat shooting up from the hot flue beneath the moss. He knew the moment when the vine was going to break from the earth, and he felt the juices gathering and flowing from the roots into the grapes. And all the time he seemed at home, tending the cow, or making his father's supper, or reading a fairy tale as he sat waiting for him to come home. At length the evening of the 3rd day arrived. Colin squeezed the rich red grapes into his bottle, corked it, shouldered his spade, and turned homewards, guided by a peak which he knew in the distance. After walking all night in the moonlight, he came at length upon a place which he recognized, and so down upon the brook which he followed home. He met his father going out with his sheep. Great was his delight to see Colin again, for he had been dreadfully anxious about him. Colin told him the whole story, and as at that time marvels were much easier to believe than they are now, Colin's father did not laugh at him, but went away to the hills thinking, while Colin went on to the cottage, where he found plenty to do, having been 9 days gone. He laid the bottle carefully away with his Sunday clothes, and set about everything just as usual. But though the fairy brook was running merrily as ever through the cottage, and although Colin watched late every night, and latest when the moon shone, no fairy fleet came glimmering and dancing in along the stream. Autumn was there at length, and cold fogs began to rise in the cottage, and so Colin turned the brook into its old course, and filled up the breaches in the walls and the channel along the floor, making it all close against the blasts of winter. But he had never known such a weary winter before. He could not help constantly thinking how cold the little girl must be, and how she would be saying to herself, "I wish Colin hadn't been so silly and lost me." 6. The consequences. But at last the spring came, and after the spring the summer. And the very first warm day Colin took his spade and pickaxe, and down rushed the stream once more, singing and bounding into the cottage. Colin was even more delighted than he had been the first time, and he watched late into the night, but there never came neither moon nor fairy fleet, and more than a week passed thus. At length, on the 9th night, Colin, who had just fallen asleep, opened his eyes with sudden wakefulness, and behold, the room was all in a glimmer with moonshine and fairy glitter. The boats were rocking on the water, and the Queen and her court had landed and were dancing merrily on the earthen floor. He lost no time. "Queen, Queen," he said, "I've got your bottle of Carasoyn." The dance ceased in a moment, and the Queen bounded upon the edge of his bed. "I can't bear the look of your great glaring ugly eyes," she said. "I must make you less before I can talk to you." So once more she laid her rush wand across his eyes, whereupon Colin saw them all 6 times the size they were before, and the Queen went on, "Where is the Carasoyn? Give it me." "It is in my box under the bed. If your Majesty will stand out of the way, I will get it for you." The Queen jumped on the floor, and Colin, leaning from the bed, pulled out his little box and got out the bottle. "There it is, your Majesty," he said, but not offering it to her. "Give it me directly," said the Queen, holding out her hand. "First give me my little girl," returned Colin boldly. "Do you dare to bargain with me?" said the Queen angrily. "Your Majesty deigned to bargain with me first," said Colin. "But since then you tried to break all our necks. You made a wicked cataract out there on the other side of the garden. Our boats were all dashed to pieces, and we had to wait till our horses were fetched. If I had been killed, you couldn't have held me to my bargain, and I won't hold to it now." "If you chose to go down my cataract," began Colin. "Your cataract!" cried the Queen. "All the waters that run from Loch Lonely are mine, I can tell you, all the way to the sea." "Except where they run through farmyards, your Majesty." "I'll rout you out of the country," said the Queen. "Meantime, I'll put the bottle in the chest again," returned Colin. The Queen bit her lips with vexation. "Come here, changeling," she cried at length, and the little girl came slowly up to her and stood staring at Colin with the tears in her eyes. "Give me your hand, little girl," said he, holding out his. She did so. It was cold as ice. "Let go her hand," said the Queen. "I won't," said Colin. "She's mine." "Give me the bottle, then," said the Queen. "Don't," said the child. But it was too late. The Queen had it. "Keep your girl," she cried with an ugly laugh. "Yes, keep me," cried the child. The cry ended in a hiss. Colin felt something slimy wriggling in his grasp, and looking down, saw that instead of a little girl, he was holding a great writhing worm. He had almost flung it from himself, but recovering himself, he grasped it tighter. "If it's a snake, I'll choke it," he said. "If it's a girl, I'll keep her." The same instant it changed to a little white rabbit, which looked him piteously in the face and tried to get its little forefoot out of his hand. But though he tried not to hurt it, Colin would not let it go. Then the rabbit changed to a great black cat with eyes that flashed green fire. She sputtered and spit and swelled her tail, but all to no purpose. Colin held fast. Then it was a wood pigeon, struggling and fluttering in terror to get its wing out of his hold. But still Colin held fast. All this time the Queen had been getting the cork out. The moment it yielded, she gave a scream and dropped the bottle. The Carasoyn ran out, and a strange odor filled the cottage. The Queen stood shivering and sobbing beside the bottle, and all her court came about and shivered and sobbed too, and their faces grew ancient and wrinkled. Then the Queen, bending and tottering like an old woman, led the way to the boats, and her courtiers followed, limping and creeping and distorted. Colin stared in amazement. He saw them all go aboard, and he heard the sound of them like a far-off company of men and women crying bitterly. And away they floated down the stream, the rowers dipping no oar, but bending weeping over them, and letting the boat drift along the stream. They vanished from his sight, and the rush of the cataract came up on the night wind louder than he'd ever heard it before. But alas, when he came to himself, he found his hand relaxed, and the dove flown. Once more there was nothing left but to cry himself asleep, as well he might. So has he actually lost the girl a second time? We'll find out next time. Thank you.